What if a text could vanish without ever truly disappearing, leaving behind only fragments, quotations, and uneasy footnotes in other men's books? What if the absence itself became the most enduring trace? There are moments in the historical record where silence feels less like decay and more like deliberate space. An empty corridor where a door once stood. The Book of Enoch exists in such a corridor. It is cited, debated, translated, condemned, preserved, and yet for centuries it was said to be lost. In that long interval, something curious happened to the beings it describes, the Watchers. The name surfaces in a form of Aramaic used in the Book of Daniel, composed in the Hellenistic period, likely in the 2nd century BCE. There, Watchers appear briefly as heavenly beings, awake and observing. The term is simple. It carries no elaborate mythology. It does not yet strain against theology. It is a word that implies vigilance, not rebellion. But elsewhere, in texts attributed to Enoch, the figure expands. The Watchers become a group, a descent, an intrusion into human history. The Enochic writings, especially what scholars call First Enoch, present a layered composition. Modern researchers date its oldest sections to the 3rd century BCE, with later additions extending into the 1st century BCE. The work survives most fully in Ge'ez, preserved in the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, where it remains canonical. Fragments in Aramaic were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran in the mid-20th century, confirming that parts of the text circulated in Judea centuries before the Common Era. Before those scrolls were unearthed, much of the book was known only through quotations, by early Christian writers such as Tertullian, and by references in the Epistle of Jude in the New Testament. The trail of citations suggested something substantial once existed. Yet, in the dominant branches of Rabbinic Judaism and later in most of Christianity, the book did not enter the canon. It was neither fully embraced nor entirely erased. It lingered in a space that scholars sometimes describe as parabiblical, neither scripture nor simple legend. In that space, the Watchers became a problem. According to the Book of the Watchers, the earliest section of First Enoch, a group of angels descends to earth in the days before the flood. Their leader is named Shemihaza in some manuscripts. Another figure, Azazel, emerges as a teacher of forbidden knowledge, metalworking, cosmetics, weaponry. The narrative describes unions between these beings and human women, resulting in offspring called Nephilim, giants who consume and devastate the earth. The earth cries out. The archangels report the corruption. Judgment follows. The Watchers are bound in darkness, awaiting a final reckoning. The account parallels, yet expands upon, a brief and enigmatic passage in Genesis 6:1-4. There, sons of God take human wives, and the Nephilim appear. The biblical text offers no elaboration, no names, no speeches, no imprisonment beneath mountains. It moves quickly toward the flood narrative. The Enochic tradition slows down at precisely that gap. It fills it with detail, hierarchy, and cosmology. This is where the contradiction sharpens. Genesis became canonical in Judaism and Christianity. One Enoch did not, except in Ethiopia. Yet the Enochic version appears to interpret Genesis, not the other way around. It reads as commentary, but with the force of revelation. Some scholars argue that the Enochic expansion reflects Second Temple Jewish speculation on the problem of evil, an attempt to explain how violence and corruption entered the world. Others suggest it encodes older mythic traditions, possibly influenced by Mesopotamian lore about apkallu, semi-divine sages associated with antediluvian knowledge. The apkallu appear in cuneiform sources as culture bringers, often depicted as fish-cloaked figures. In some later Mesopotamian traditions, certain apkallu are portrayed negatively, blamed for corrupting humanity before the flood. The parallels are suggestive, but not universally accepted. Cultural exchange in the ancient Near East was complex and multidirectional. Direct borrowing is difficult to prove. The record thins out precisely where certainty would be convenient. What is clear is that the Watchers' narrative circulated widely enough to be copied at Qumran. The Aramaic fragments discovered in K4, identified in the 1950s, include portions of the Book of the Watchers. Paleographic analysis places them between the 3rd and 1st centuries BCE. This indicates that the story was not marginal at its origin. It was read, transmitted, and perhaps debated among communities who also preserved other texts later considered scriptural. Why then did it recede? The reasons are not recorded in a single decree. Canon formation was gradual, shaped by liturgical use, theological coherence, and communal authority. Some early Christian thinkers valued First Enoch, others were wary of its elaborate angelology. Rabbinic tradition, consolidating after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, did not include it in the Hebrew Bible. Over time, texts outside the canon became less accessible. Language barriers compounded the effect. As Greek and Aramaic receded in certain regions, and as Ge'ez remained localized, the book's transmission narrowed. In Europe, knowledge of First Enoch was largely indirect until the late 18th century, when James Bruce brought Ge'ez manuscripts from Ethiopia to Britain. Translations followed. Scholars began comparing the Ethiopic text with references in early Christian writings. When the Dead Sea Scrolls confirmed the book's antiquity, the silence around it shifted. It was no longer a medieval curiosity preserved on the margins of Christendom. It was a voice from the Second Temple period, speaking from a time when Jewish thought was still fluid, when angels and demons occupied intellectual space not yet sealed by later orthodoxy. The Watchers stood at the center of that voice. They were neither gods nor merely metaphors. They inhabited a cosmology in which heaven and earth were porous. Their fall explained suffering. Their binding postponed final judgment. Yet even within Enochic literature, layers of redaction and reinterpretation are visible. Some passages emphasize cosmic order restored. Others dwell on punishment. The narrative resists a single tone. What remains unsettled is the origin of the Watchers themselves. Were they a development from earlier Israelite angelology? A reinterpretation of Mesopotamian myth? A polemic against foreign wisdom traditions? Or an imaginative solution to a theological problem that Genesis left open? Scholars propose, compare, revise. Footnotes multiply. Agreement remains partial. The gap persists. In museum archives and university libraries, manuscripts rest in controlled climates. The Aramaic fragments from Qumran are carefully preserved, their edges darkened by time. The Ethiopic manuscripts, copied by generations of scribes, carry marginal notes in red ink. Between them stretches a long history of absence in much of the Western canon. The Watchers move through that absence, gaining new interpretations in medieval lore, in Renaissance angelology, and in modern speculative literature. Each era reshaped them, sometimes cautiously, sometimes extravagantly. Yet behind these reinterpretations lies the older question: why did a tradition once copied in Judean caves become peripheral elsewhere? The answer is not sealed in a single archive. It lies scattered across councils, commentaries, and shifting theological boundaries. And at the center of that scattering stands a story of beings who crossed a boundary of their own. The record, for now, offers fragments and debates. It offers caves near the Dead Sea and highland monasteries in Ethiopia. It offers a name, Watchers, that appears simple, then unfolds into something heavier. The silence around their origin is not empty. It hums with competing explanations, each incomplete. Somewhere between Genesis and Qumran, between Ge'ez manuscripts and modern translations, the trail narrows. The next question presses forward quietly. If the Watchers were not merely literary inventions, but reflections of older ideas, where did those ideas begin to take shape? The sources grow thinner as that question approaches. The search for origins rarely begins where the story seems to start. In the case of the Watchers, the trail leads backward beyond the Book of Enoch, beyond the Aramaic fragments from Qumran, into a landscape where Israelite religion had not yet settled into its later forms. The word itself, watcher, in Aramaic, appears only sparingly in the Hebrew Bible. In Daniel, it designates a heavenly being who descends in a dream to pronounce judgment on a king. The tone is formal, almost bureaucratic. A watcher decrees. A watcher announces. There is no hint of rebellion. Yet, even this brief usage suggests a broader cosmology in which divine beings observe human affairs. Earlier biblical texts speak of a divine council. Psalm 82 portrays God standing among other divine figures, judging them. The book of Job opens with sons of God presenting themselves before the Lord, among them a figure called the Satan, an accuser, not yet the later embodiment of evil. Deuteronomy 32, in one textual tradition preserved in the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint, speaks of nations allotted according to the number of the sons of God. These passages are fragmentary windows into a worldview where the heavens were populated, structured, and active. Scholars often describe ancient Israelite religion as emerging within a wider West Semitic environment. In Ugaritic texts from the 2nd millennium BCE, discovered at Ras Shamra in modern Syria, a high god named El presides over an assembly of lesser deities. The parallels between El and certain biblical depictions of Israel's God have long been discussed. The concept of a divine council was not unique to Israel. It was a common way of imagining cosmic governance in the ancient Near East. The Watchers, however, are not merely members of a council. In First Enoch, they descend, transgress, and are punished. The narrative transforms a celestial hierarchy into a drama of disobedience. The question arises, what prompted this transformation? Some researchers suggest that the exilic and post-exilic periods were decisive. In the 6th century BCE, the Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem and the subsequent exile confronted Judean communities with theological crisis. The destruction of the temple raised questions about divine justice and power. During and after this period, Jewish thought absorbed and reinterpreted elements from surrounding cultures, including Persian ideas encountered under Achaemenid rule. Zoroastrianism, with its developed angelology and demonology, may have influenced certain strands of Jewish apocalyptic thinking, though the extent of that influence remains debated. Apocalyptic literature flourished in the centuries following the exile. It often addressed communities under foreign domination, offering visions of cosmic conflict and ultimate vindication. The Book of Daniel, composed during the Seleucid persecutions of the 2nd century BCE, exemplifies this genre. Its watchers announce judgment within a symbolic framework that reassures the faithful of divine sovereignty. The Book of the Watchers, likely composed around the 3rd century BCE, belongs to this broader apocalyptic movement. It amplifies earlier hints of celestial beings into a detailed narrative of rebellion. But it does so by anchoring the rebellion in a time before the flood, relocating the source of corruption to primordial history. This move shifts the burden of evil away from immediate political oppressors and toward a cosmic past. The violence of empires becomes part of a longer arc of corruption introduced by fallen angels. At the same time, the Watchers are depicted as transmitters of knowledge. Azazel teaches metalworking and weaponry. Others reveal astrology, enchantments, the cutting of roots. These details have drawn sustained scholarly attention. Some interpret them as critiques of certain technologies or cultural practices. Others see them as reflections of anxieties about foreign influence, especially in a Hellenistic context where Greek science and art were spreading through the Near East. The motif of divine or semi-divine beings imparting knowledge to humanity was not new. In Mesopotamian tradition, the apkallu were associated with wisdom before the flood. Berossus, a Hellenistic Babylonian priest writing in Greek in the 3rd century BCE, described Awans, a fish-like being who emerged from the sea to teach civilization to humans. Earlier cuneiform sources attest to antediluvian sages linked to the god Ea, Enki. In some late texts, certain apkallu are blamed for transgressions, though the evidence is complex and not uniformly negative. The comparison between Watchers and apkallu has been explored by scholars such as Amar Anis and others. Similarities include the pre-flood setting, the transmission of specialized knowledge, and eventual judgment or restriction. Yet differences remain. The apkallu are often culture heroes, not rebels. The moral framework of First Enoch is sharper. Its Watchers violate a boundary by taking human wives. a boundary that seems to matter more than the knowledge they share. This emphasis on intermarriage has led some interpreters to connect the narrative with concerns about endogamy in post-exilic Judaism. Texts such as Ezra and Nehemiah reflect anxiety over marriages between Judeans and foreign women, associating such unions with covenantal unfaithfulness. The Watchers' unions with human women could function symbolically within this context. Still, the scale of the Enochic drama exceeds local reform. It situates the transgression in heaven itself. The Dead Sea Scrolls community, often identified with the Essenes, preserved multiple copies of Enochic texts. Their own writings reveal a keen interest in angelology and cosmic dualism. They describe themselves as participants in a battle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. The Enochic portrayal of bound angels awaiting judgment would have resonated within such a worldview. Yet the scrolls do not provide a clear statement about why the Watchers' narrative originated. They testify only to its circulation and significance. As the Second Temple period progressed, other Jewish texts revisited the Genesis 6 passage differently. The Book of Jubilees, likely composed in the 2nd century BCE, also expands on the story but modifies details. It emphasizes the role of evil spirits descended from the giants. Later rabbinic tradition tended to interpret the sons of God in Genesis as human judges or nobles, not angels, thereby avoiding the implication of angelic sexuality. This interpretive move suggests discomfort with the idea of divine beings crossing into human flesh. The early Christian reception of the Watchers adds another layer. The Epistle of Jude refers to angels who did not keep their own position and are kept in eternal chains. 2 Peter echoes this theme. Church fathers such as Irenaeus and Tertullian cited Enoch in discussions of angelic fall. Over time, however, many Christian theologians preferred to identify the Genesis 6 sons of God with the line of Seth rather than with angels. Augustine, in the 4th and 5th centuries CE, argued against the angelic interpretation in the City of God. His authority influenced Western theology profoundly. The trajectory suggests not a single act of suppression, but a gradual narrowing of acceptable cosmology. As monotheism was articulated with increasing philosophical precision, space for semi-divine intermediaries acting independently may have felt theologically unstable. The Watchers, once explanatory, became problematic. And yet, the fragments at Qumran demonstrate that before this narrowing, the story held power. It was copied with care, alongside other texts now canonical. It addressed questions about evil, knowledge, and boundary crossing in a language that resonated with communities living under imperial rule. The origin of the Watchers, then, cannot be reduced to a single borrowing or invention. It seems to emerge at the intersection of older Near Eastern motifs, evolving Israelite theology, and the pressures of exile and foreign domination. But intersections leave blurred lines. The precise moment when celestial observers became transgressors remains elusive. Beyond the caves of Qumran and the pages of Ethiopic manuscripts, older myths wait in broken tablets and fragmentary hymns. Somewhere within those earlier layers may lie a shape that the Watchers later assumed, altered, intensified, reinterpreted. The path leads further back, into clay and cuneiform, where the Watchers may not yet bear that name. Long before the Aramaic term for watcher appeared in the Book of Daniel, scribes pressed wedge-shaped signs into clay along the rivers of Mesopotamia. These tablets, hardened by sun or kiln, preserved myths and royal inscriptions from the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE. Many were buried in palace archives and temple storerooms, only to be unearthed in the 19th and 20th centuries by archaeologists working in places such as Nineveh, Nimrud, and Uruk. Among the recovered texts were accounts of beings who stood between gods and humans, figures neither wholly divine nor entirely mortal. In Akkadian sources, the apkallu are described as sages of antediluvian times. Their names appear in lists associated with early kings. Some texts portray them as created by the god Ea, known in Sumerian as Enki, a deity of wisdom and fresh waters. Artistic depictions from the Neo-Assyrian period show fish-cloaked figures and winged beings engaged in ritual acts, often flanking sacred trees. These images are usually interpreted as protective spirits or priests wearing ritual costumes, though scholarly debate continues over their precise identification. Berossus, writing in the 3rd century BCE under Seleucid rule, offered a Greek account of Babylonian traditions. He described Oans, a creature emerging from the sea, half man and half fish, who taught humanity writing, law, and crafts. According to later summaries of Berossus preserved by authors such as Alexander Polyhistor and Eusebius, other similar beings followed. The record is mediated through layers of quotation and translation. The original work of Berossus survives only in fragments cited by others. Even so, the theme of culture bringers from a primordial age stands clear. The connection between apkallu and watchers rests partly on chronology. Both are situated before a great flood. Both are associated with the transmission of knowledge. In certain late Babylonian texts, there are hints that some apkallu were implicated in wrongdoing. A fragmentary text, sometimes called the Uruk list of kings and sages, includes references to sages linked to specific rulers, and some scholars argue that in later retellings, the sages' influence was viewed ambivalently. Yet the evidence is not uniform. Many Mesopotamian sources treat the apkallu as positive figures, guardians of order rather than agents of chaos. The Enochic Watchers, by contrast, are explicitly condemned. They swear an oath on Mount Hermon, according to First Enoch, binding themselves to their descent. The mountain's name is explained within the narrative as deriving from the oath, though this etymology is likely secondary, shaped by the story itself. The geographic detail places the event in the northern Levant, a region long connected by trade and conflict to Mesopotamia. Cultural exchange across these corridors is historically plausible. Direct literary dependence, however, remains difficult to demonstrate conclusively. Archaeology complicates and enriches the picture. At sites such as Tel Halaf and Dur Sharkin, reliefs depict winged genies holding pine cones and buckets, often interpreted as performing purification rituals. These figures are sometimes labeled apkallu in modern scholarship, though the ancient texts do not always match the imagery neatly. The visual vocabulary of wings and hybrid forms traveled across cultures. In the Levant, Phoenician art absorbed and adapted Mesopotamian motifs. The Hebrew Bible itself includes descriptions of cherubim, composite beings with wings, guarding sacred spaces. The Watchers of Enoch are not described in visual detail comparable to Assyrian reliefs. Their characterization is narrative and moral rather than iconographic. They are defined by action, descent, teaching, union, punishment. This difference suggests that if there was influence, it was not simple replication of imagery. It may have been conceptual, reframed within a monotheistic worldview that rejected the independent divinity of other gods. The Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE brought Judean elites into direct contact with Mesopotamian culture. They encountered temples, archives, and scribal traditions older than their own. The Book of Ezekiel, composed in exile, contains visions of complex celestial beings, wheels within wheels, creatures with multiple faces. Scholars often note the resemblance between Ezekiel's cherubim and Mesopotamian throne guardians. These parallels do not prove borrowing in a narrow sense, but they illustrate a shared symbolic environment. Within that environment, ideas about primordial sages and heavenly intermediaries circulated. The transformation of such figures into rebels in First Enoch could represent an internal Jewish reinterpretation of inherited motifs. By relocating the source of forbidden knowledge to fallen angels, the Enochic author reframed wisdom traditions as morally ambiguous. Metalworking, cosmetics, astrology, skills admired in some cultures, became signs of corruption in this narrative. The flood, in turn, became not only divine judgment on human wickedness, but also on celestial transgression. Yet caution is necessary. The leap from apkallu to watchers is not documented in a single ancient statement. There is no surviving tablet that announces a shift from Mesopotamian sage to Jewish fallen angel. The comparison is constructed by modern scholars drawing on thematic parallels. Some accept the connection as persuasive. Others argue for independent development. Cultural convergence can produce similar motifs without direct literary dependence. The Qumran fragments add a chronological anchor. They show that the Book of the Watchers existed in Aramaic centuries before the Common Era. The Mesopotamian traditions of apkallu are older still, stretching back over a millennium. The temporal gap allows for influence, but it also allows for transformation across generations of retelling. By the Hellenistic period, when one Enoch likely reached written form, Judean communities had passed through exile, Persian rule, and the conquests of Alexander the Great. Their intellectual world was layered with multiple inheritances. Another possible strand enters from the realm of mythic geography. Mount Hermon, named in First Enoch as the place of descent, stands at the northern boundary of ancient Israelite territory. It was associated with foreign powers and with Bashan, a region sometimes depicted in biblical poetry as linked to rival deities. Deuteronomy 3 refers to King Og of Bashan, whose bed is described in exaggerated dimensions. Later Jewish tradition sometimes associated Bashan with giants. The Watchers' descent to Hermon situates their rebellion at a liminal edge, a frontier between Israel and the wider world. Such details suggest that the Enochic author was not merely copying foreign myths, but weaving them into a specifically Israelite narrative landscape. The giants born of the Watchers echo both Genesis 6 and regional traditions about enormous ancestral figures. The punishment of the angels beneath the earth aligns with ancient conceptions of the underworld as a place of confinement. These elements converge without fully dissolving into a single source. The clay tablets of Mesopotamia do not mention Shemihaza or Azazel. The Ethiopic manuscripts do not name Oannes. The record presents echoes rather than direct quotations. Across centuries, scribes wrote, copied, adapted. Ideas traveled along trade routes and through imperial administrations. They changed language, tone, moral emphasis. In the dim light of archives, scholars compare fragments, cuneiform signs on one side, Aramaic script on another. They trace patterns cautiously. Each proposed connection carries footnotes and counter-arguments. The origin of the Watchers remains partly obscured, not by deliberate concealment, but by the ordinary erosion of time. If the Mesopotamian sages stand at one possible beginning, another path leads through the internal evolution of Jewish thought itself. The divine council becomes more structured. Angels acquire names and functions. Apocalyptic visions multiply. Somewhere within that development, the Watchers take shape as figures of boundary crossing and consequence. The clay has been read and reread. The ink on parchment has faded and been restored. Still, the transformation from observer to rebel resists a single, clean explanation. The next layer of inquiry turns toward the communities that preserve the text most carefully, asking what the Watchers meant to them and why their fall mattered so deeply. The caves near the Dead Sea hold part of that answer, though not all of it. The cliffs of Qumran rise in pale tiers above the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. Wind moves through the marl terraces, carrying dust into the mouths of caves that once sheltered scrolls wrapped in linen. In 1947, Bedouin shepherds searching for a stray goat entered one of these caves and found jars containing ancient manuscripts. Over the following decade, archaeologists and scholars uncovered fragments from 11 caves in the vicinity. Among biblical texts and sectarian writings were portions of a work long known primarily through Ethiopic manuscripts, First Enoch. The discovery altered the scholarly landscape. Before Qumran, some doubted whether the Book of Enoch truly originated in the Second Temple period. The Aramaic fragments, paleographically dated between the 3rd and 1st centuries BCE, confirmed that substantial parts of the text circulated in Judea well before the Common Era. The Book of the Watchers, in particular, appeared in multiple copies. This was not an isolated curiosity. It was copied with care, preserved alongside other authoritative writings. The community associated with Qumran, often linked to the Essenes described by Josephus, Philo, and Pliny the Elder, valued apocalyptic literature. Their own compositions, such as the War Scroll and the Community Rule, depict a cosmos divided between forces of light and darkness. Angels play active roles in their self-understanding. The members of the community saw themselves as aligned with heavenly hosts, participating in a spiritual struggle that extended beyond visible history. Within such a worldview, the Watchers were not distant mythic figures. They embodied the memory of a primordial breach. The idea that angels had once transgressed provided a precedent for cosmic disorder. It also underscored the seriousness of obedience. If even heavenly beings could fall, vigilance was required of humans living in the final days. The Qumran fragments of Enoch are incomplete. They preserve portions of the Book of the Watchers, the Book of the Giants, and other sections. The Book of the Giants, also found among the scrolls, expands on the offspring of the Watchers, depicting dreams and ominous portents before the flood. These Aramaic fragments were later compared with a Manichaean text discovered in Central Asia, which also contained a version of the Giants' narrative. The parallel suggests that Enochic traditions traveled far beyond Judea, adapting to new religious contexts. Yet the Qumran library does not include every text later considered scriptural. The absence of certain books and the presence of others indicate a canon still in formation. The Enochic literature appears to have held significant authority within this community, though whether it was regarded as scripture in the same sense as the Torah is debated. The boundaries between scripture, commentary, and inspired interpretation were more fluid than they would later become. After the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE and the eventual dispersal of Jewish groups, the Qumran settlement was abandoned. The scrolls remained hidden for nearly 2 millennia. In the rabbinic movement that emerged in the centuries following the temple's fall, emphasis settled firmly on the Torah and the prophetic books. Texts like First Enoch, though known, did not enter the developing rabbinic canon. The reasons are not documented in a single council decision. They likely involve a combination of theological concerns, shifts in authority, and the gradual standardization of sacred texts. Meanwhile, early Christian writers engaged the Enochic tradition with varying degrees of enthusiasm. The Epistle of Jude quotes a prophecy attributed to Enoch. Tertullian, writing in the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries CE, defended the book's value, arguing that its rejection by some stemmed from its explicit reference to Christ. Others were more cautious. By the time of Augustine, the angelic interpretation of Genesis 6 had lost favor in much of the Latin West. Augustine's alternative reading, identifying the sons of God as descendants of Seth, minimized the need for a narrative like that of the Watchers. In Ethiopia, however, the trajectory differed. Christianity reached the Aksumite kingdom by the 4th century CE. Over time, a corpus of biblical and related literature was translated into Ge'ez. Among these texts was First Enoch. In the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, it became part of the broader canon. Manuscripts copied in monasteries preserved the narrative through centuries when it was scarcely known in Europe. The reasons for its canonical status in Ethiopia remain a subject of scholarly discussion. Geographic distance from the theological debates of the Latin and Greek worlds may have played a role. So too may local traditions and interpretive frameworks that found resonance with Enochic themes. The survival of First Enoch in Ethiopia underscores how transmission shapes memory. A text can fade in one region while remaining vibrant in another. The Watchers, bound beneath the earth in the narrative, were not entirely bound in history. They continued to inhabit liturgy and commentary in certain communities, even as they reseeded elsewhere. The rediscovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls reintroduced the Watchers to modern scholarship with renewed urgency. No longer could the book be dismissed as a late invention. Its antiquity was materially attested. Researchers began reassessing Second Temple Judaism with greater attention to its diversity. The notion of a single uniform Judaism before the Common Era gave way to a more complex picture of competing interpretations and evolving doctrines. Within that complexity, the Watchers occupy a particular niche. They reflect an apocalyptic strand concerned with cosmic justice. They offer an explanation for evil rooted not solely in human choice, but in a rupture between heaven and earth. At the same time, they reveal anxiety about knowledge and boundary. The skills imparted by the Watchers are not neutral. They carry consequences. The giants born of their unions embody excess and imbalance. The caves at Qumran hold only fragments. Gaps punctuate the parchment. Lines break mid-sentence. Scholars reconstruct missing portions through comparison with Ethiopic manuscripts and later citations. Each reconstruction carries degrees of probability, not certainty. The physical state of the scrolls mirrors the state of the tradition itself, partial, layered, subject to interpretation. Why did this particular narrative gain such traction among certain groups? One answer may lie in its capacity to address injustice without accusing God directly. By attributing corruption to fallen angels, the text preserves divine goodness while acknowledging pervasive violence. It externalizes the origin of evil in a way that resonates with communities experiencing oppression. Yet, even this explanation does not exhaust the question. The Watchers are not merely villains. They are complex figures whose dissent suggests longing or defiance. Their oath on Hermon conveys solidarity as well as rebellion. The text does not present their motives in philosophical detail. It narrates their action and its consequences, leaving interpretation open. The Qumran library closes its jars. The settlement falls silent under Roman boots. Centuries pass. In Ethiopian monasteries, scribes bend over parchment, tracing Ge'ez characters in careful lines. Across these distances, the Watchers persist, though their prominence shifts. The investigation now turns to the theological tensions that surrounded their story in the centuries when canons hardened and boundaries narrowed. What, precisely, made the Watchers difficult to contain within emerging orthodoxies? The record offers clues, but they are scattered across councils, commentaries, and the slow consolidation of doctrine. Beyond the cliffs and caves, another corridor of history opens, dimly lit by debates over angels and flesh. As the first centuries of the Common Era unfolded, Christian communities spread across the eastern Mediterranean and into North Africa and Europe. Letters circulated, gospels were copied, interpretations multiplied. Within this ferment, questions about angels were not peripheral. They touched the nature of Christ, the structure of heaven, and the boundaries between spirit and flesh. The narrative of the Watchers posed a particular difficulty. If angels could assume bodies, desire human women, and father offspring, then the ontological distinction between heavenly and earthly realms became porous in ways that unsettled emerging theological clarity. The Book of Enoch presented angels as capable of lust, instruction, oath-taking, and punishment beneath mountains. This was not a metaphorical lapse. It was a literal descent. Some early Christian writers accepted this portrayal. Justin Martyr, in the 2nd century, referred to angels who transgressed and produced demons. Irenaeus echoed similar themes, linking angelic fall to the corruption of humanity. Tertullian, writing in Carthage around the turn of the 3rd century, cited Enoch explicitly. He argued that its exclusion from some Jewish circles did not negate its value, suggesting that those who rejected it did so because it testified to Christ. Yet even in these early centuries, dissenting voices emerged. Origen, in the 3rd century, engaged deeply with angelology, but approached apocalyptic literature with caution. By the time Augustine composed The City of God in the early 5th century, the theological climate had shifted. Augustine rejected the interpretation that angels cohabited with women. He insisted that spiritual beings could not engage in physical reproduction. The sons of God in Genesis, he argued, were descendants of Seth, intermarrying with the line of Cain. This reading preserved a strict separation between angelic and human natures. Augustine's authority in the Latin West was immense. His interpretation shaped medieval theology. Over time, the angelic reading of Genesis 6 receded in Western Christianity. The Watcher's narrative, closely tied to that reading, lost ground. It was not formally banned by a single ecumenical council, but it became peripheral. Lists of canonical books stabilized. Texts outside those lists were copied less frequently. In some cases, they survived only in quotations embedded in polemical works. In the Greek East, attitudes were varied. Some Byzantine writers were aware of Enochic traditions, though they did not grant them canonical status. The process of canon formation was gradual and complex. involving liturgical use, theological coherence, and regional consensus. By the late 4th century, councils such as those at Hippo, 393 CE, and Carthage, 397 CE, in North Africa listed books considered authoritative in the Latin Church. One Enoch was not among them. Was not. The marginalization of the Watcher's narrative cannot be reduced solely to concerns about angelic sexuality. Broader theological priorities were at stake. As Christianity engaged Greco-Roman philosophy, especially Platonism, the immateriality and incorporeality of angels became emphasized. The idea that spiritual beings could assume dense flesh and produce hybrid offspring strained philosophical categories. It also risked encouraging speculative mythologies that church leaders sought to discipline. At the same time, Jewish rabbinic tradition developed along its own trajectory. The Mishnah, compiled around 200 CE, and later the Talmud, focused on legal interpretation and communal practice. While angelic lore did not disappear from rabbinic literature, it was not elaborated in the expansive apocalyptic manner found in First Enoch. The Genesis 6 passage was often interpreted in ways that avoided attributing sexual transgression to angels. This convergence between rabbinic and Augustinian caution, though emerging from distinct contexts, contributed to the narrowing of space for the Watchers. In Ethiopia, however, isolation from these particular debates allowed a different canon to crystallize. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church preserved a broader collection of texts, including Jubilees and First Enoch. The Ge'ez manuscripts that reached Europe in the 18th century bore witness to a tradition uninterrupted by Western exclusion. James Bruce's acquisition of Enoch manuscripts in the 1770s reintroduced the work to European scholars who had known it only through fragments and patristic citations. The reappearance of First Enoch in modern scholarship coincided with the rise of historical critical methods. Scholars began analyzing biblical texts in their ancient contexts, comparing manuscripts, and tracing sources. The Watchers were no longer evaluated primarily through theological orthodoxy, but through historical inquiry. Their narrative was situated within Second Temple Judaism, alongside other apocalyptic writings such as 4 Ezra and 2 Baruch. This shift did not resolve the tension. It reframed it. The question was no longer whether angels could mate with humans in a doctrinal sense, but why a community would tell such a story. The Watchers became data in a larger investigation into the development of Jewish thought about evil, knowledge, and cosmic hierarchy. Modern readers sometimes project later categories backward, imagining suppression where the evidence points instead to gradual disuse. Texts fall from prominence for many reasons: linguistic change, shifting liturgical needs, theological consolidation. The Watchers' decline in most branches of Judaism and Christianity appears to have been a slow fading rather than a dramatic erasure. Still, the effect was profound. For centuries in Europe, the fuller Enochic account was absent from common discourse. Genesis 6 stood largely on its own, interpreted through lenses that minimized its ambiguity. The Watchers remained in Ethiopia and in scattered references, but they did not shape mainstream theology. When the Dead Sea Scrolls emerged in the 20th century, they disrupted assumptions about the uniformity of early Judaism. They revealed a world in which angelic hierarchies, cosmic battles, and elaborate eschatologies were not fringe speculations, but integral to certain communities. The Watchers re-entered scholarly conversation not as curiosities, but as witnesses to a formative period. The theological tensions that once marginalized them now appear as historical phenomena in their own right. Augustine's rejection, rabbinic reinterpretation, Ethiopian preservation, each reflects a particular configuration of authority and doctrine. The Watchers stand at the crossroads of these configurations, illuminating how ideas travel, transform, and sometimes recede. Yet, even as scholarship situates them within history, questions linger. Did the Enochic author intend the Watchers as literal beings, symbolic constructs, or something between? How did ancient listeners hear the story when it was first recited? The sources do not provide transcripts of those early reactions. They offer only the text itself and the traces of its transmission. Beyond doctrinal debates lies the deeper issue of why the narrative held such explanatory power. It addressed violence, corruption, and forbidden knowledge in a single arc. It suggested that disorder began not merely in human hearts, but in a breach above them. In the quiet of libraries and monasteries, the Watchers waded through centuries of theological refinement. Their story, once central to certain communities, became a marginal note in others. Now, with fragments in hand and manuscripts compared, the investigation presses further. What did the descent of the Watchers signify in the symbolic language of the ancient world? The answer may lie not only in texts, but in the fears and aspirations that shaped them. The descent of the Watchers unfolds in First Enoch with deliberate pacing. 200 angels, according to the text, look down upon human women and desire them. They fear acting alone and bind themselves by oath on Mount Hermon. The oath transforms intention into collective resolve. From that moment, the boundary between heaven and earth is crossed not by accident, but by decision. The symbolism of descent carries weight in ancient cosmology. Heaven is ordered, luminous, structured. Earth is mutable, vulnerable, subject to decay. When beings move downward, they enter a realm of limitation. In Mesopotamian myth, gods descend to the underworld at great risk. In biblical literature, divine descent often signals intervention. At Sinai, in prophetic visions, in acts of judgment. The Watcher's descent differs. It is not commissioned by the Most High, it is self-initiated. The oath on Hermon marks a threshold. Mountains in the ancient Near East were liminal spaces associated with divine presence. Mount Zaphon in Ugaritic texts was the dwelling of Baal. Sinai became the site of covenant revelation. Hermon, rising at the northern frontier, carried its own aura of elevation and distance. By situating the oath there, the narrative anchors cosmic rebellion in a recognizable geography. It does not float in abstract myth. It touches stone and snow. The knowledge imparted by the Watchers is cataloged with specificity. Azazel teaches metalworking, how to fashion swords and shields. Others reveal astrology, enchantments, and the cutting of roots. The list has prompted varied interpretations. Some scholars read it as critique of technologies associated with warfare and vanity. The mention of cosmetics and jewelry has been linked to moralistic concerns about seduction and excess. Astrology, widely practiced in the Hellenistic world, may have represented foreign influence in the eyes of certain Jewish groups. Yet knowledge itself is not uniformly condemned in biblical tradition. Wisdom literature, such as Proverbs, extols understanding. The problem in First Enoch appears to lie not in learning per se, but in the source and timing of revelation. The Watchers disclose secrets before their time, according to some translations. They breach a cosmic order that reserves certain knowledge for God's appointed seasons. This motif resonates with broader apocalyptic themes. In Daniel, sealed visions await future unveiling. In later Jewish and Christian texts, mysteries are disclosed to chosen seers. Revelation is legitimate when mediated by divine command. It becomes transgressive when seized prematurely. The Watchers embody that seizure. Their offspring, the giants, intensify the imbalance. The text describes them as consuming vast resources, turning against humans when sustenance fails. Violence escalates. Blood fills the earth. The narrative amplifies Genesis 6, where the Nephilim are mentioned only briefly. In First Enoch, they become agents of devastation, their presence necessitating the flood. The flood itself, in this retelling, addresses both human and angelic corruption. The archangels, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel, report the situation to God. Judgment follows. Azazel is bound and cast into darkness. The other Watchers are imprisoned beneath hills until the day of final reckoning. The earth is cleansed by water, but the spirits of the giants persist as malevolent forces, according to later Enochic expansions. This layered explanation of evil, angelic fall, hybrid violence, lingering spirits, provides a comprehensive account of suffering. It situates injustice within a cosmic narrative that precedes historical memory. For communities experiencing oppression, such a framework may have offered coherence. Evil was not random. It had an origin and a timetable for judgment. At the same time, the story reflects anxieties about boundary maintenance. The separation between divine and human spheres is foundational in much of biblical theology. The Watcher's transgression dramatizes what happens when that separation collapses. The result is not enlightenment, but chaos. Ancient audiences may have heard in this narrative echoes of their own cultural tensions. Hellenistic cities introduced new forms of knowledge, art, and governance into Judea. Debates over assimilation and identity were acute. The Watcher's teaching of foreign arts could symbolize the seductive allure of external wisdom. Yet the text does not explicitly name Greeks or Persians. It frames the issue in primordial time, avoiding direct political reference while addressing contemporary concerns indirectly. Modern interpreters must tread carefully. It is tempting to read the Watchers through lenses of later mythology or speculative theories. The historical record, however, anchors them in a specific literary and religious milieu. They arise within apocalyptic Judaism, shaped by older Near Eastern motifs and by the lived experience of communities under empire. The persistence of the Watcher's motif beyond antiquity adds further complexity. In medieval Jewish mysticism, angelic hierarchies expanded in intricate detail. In Christian demonology, fallen angels populated treatises on temptation and vice. Renaissance art depicted celestial rebellions with dramatic flourish. These later developments often drew indirectly on Enochic themes, though filtered through centuries of reinterpretation. Still, the core image remains stark. Beings assigned to watch choose instead to participate. Observation becomes involvement. Distance collapses into intimacy. The narrative suggests that certain thresholds exist for a reason. Crossing them carries consequence. Archaeological and textual evidence does not allow a definitive statement about how literally ancient readers took this account. Apocalyptic literature often employs vivid imagery to convey theological truths. Whether the Watchers were envisioned as corporeal entities or as symbolic representations of corrupt powers may have varied among audiences. The text itself speaks in narrative terms, not allegory. The imprisonment of the Watchers beneath the earth introduces another motif: hidden confinement. They are not annihilated. They are restrained, awaiting judgment. This image resonates with later Christian references to angels kept in chains. It also parallels ancient conceptions of the underworld as a place of binding for rebellious beings. The earth becomes both stage and prison. As the investigation deepens, the symbolic density of the Watcher's narrative becomes apparent. It weaves together geography, technology, cosmology, and moral concern. It speaks of knowledge that dazzles and destroys. It situates rebellion at a mountain summit and punishment beneath hills. The question that lingers is not only where the Watchers originated, but why their story assumed this particular shape. Why an oath? Why Hermon? Why the catalog of arts? Each detail suggests deliberate composition, informed by traditions both inherited and contested. Beyond the textual layers, one senses a community grappling with the boundaries of revelation and the origins of violence. The Watchers stand at that boundary, embodying both curiosity and catastrophe. The narrative has descended from heaven to earth. The next step is to follow it further into the underworld of interpretation, where giants and spirits blur into evolving demonologies. The earth above them remains silent, but the questions do not. After the flood waters recede in the Enochic account, the problem does not entirely dissolve. The giants perish, yet their spirits remain. In later sections associated with the Enochic tradition, these disembodied remnants become wandering forces, afflicting humanity. The explanation extends beyond physical corruption into the realm of invisible influence. Violence, disease, and deception acquire a genealogy that traces back to the union on Hermon. This development marks a transition from mythic prehistory to ongoing experience. If malevolent spirits originate in the bodies of destroyed giants, then evil persists not merely as memory but as active presence. The Watcher's transgression continues to echo. The narrative thus bridges primordial time and present suffering, offering continuity between ancient rebellion and contemporary distress. The notion of lingering spirits finds resonance in broader ancient Near Eastern thought. Mesopotamian texts speak of restless ghosts when proper burial rites are neglected. In biblical literature, references to unclean spirits appear in later periods, especially in Second Temple and early Christian writings. The Enochic expansion situates such spirits within a specific lineage. They are neither primordial chaos nor independent deities, but the residue of a hybrid catastrophe. The Book of the Giants, preserved in fragments at Qumran and more fully in later Manichaean sources, elaborates on this intermediate stage before the flood. Giants experience troubling dreams. They seek interpretation from Enoch, who serves as intermediary between heaven and earth. The surviving Aramaic fragments are incomplete, yet they reveal a narrative concerned with warning and impending judgment. Enoch appears not only as scribe, but as moral messenger. Enoch himself occupies a distinctive place in biblical tradition. Genesis 5 describes him briefly as one who walked with God, then he was no more because God took him. The brevity invites expansion. In First Enoch, he becomes visionary, traveler through heavenly realms, recorder of cosmic secrets. His elevation provides narrative authority. The Watcher's story is not presented as rumor, but as revelation mediated by a patriarch whose righteousness contrasts with angelic failure. The interplay between Enoch and the fallen angels introduces another layer of symbolism. A human ascends to receive knowledge lawfully, while angels descend to seize it unlawfully. The direction of movement matters. Enoch's ascent is sanctioned. The Watcher's descent is self-willed. Knowledge is not condemned. Its unauthorized transmission is. In early Christian texts, echoes of this framework appear in discussions of demons and exorcism. The Gospels depict Jesus confronting unclean spirits who recognize his authority. While these narratives do not explicitly reference the Watchers, the conceptual environment overlaps. A world populated by spirits hostile to human flourishing aligns with Enochic cosmology. Some scholars argue that familiarity with Enochic traditions among certain Jewish groups may have shaped early Christian demonology, though direct dependence is difficult to prove. Rabbinic literature, meanwhile, develops its own explanations for evil inclination, emphasizing human moral struggle rather than angelic progeny. The Yetzer Hara, or evil impulse, becomes central in later Jewish thought. This shift places responsibility within human agency rather than in primordial celestial transgression. The divergence illustrates how different communities answered similar questions with distinct frameworks. As centuries passed, the Watchers' offspring and their lingering spirits were absorbed into broader demonological systems. Medieval Christian writers cataloged fallen angels, assigning names and hierarchies. Some drew loosely from apocryphal traditions, including Enoch, yet the connection was often indirect, mediated through patristic references rather than sustained engagement with the full Enochic text. The Ethiopian tradition preserved the more expansive account, though its interpretation evolved within local theological contexts. Manuscripts copied in monasteries sometimes include marginal notes reflecting liturgical or moral concerns. The Watchers were not abstract curiosities, but part of a living textual heritage. Modern scholarship approaches these developments with caution. The temptation to construct a linear progression, from Mesopotamian sages to Enochic Watchers to medieval demons, must be balanced against the evidence of discontinuity. Ideas shift in meaning as they cross linguistic and cultural boundaries. The spirits of the giants in First Enoch are not identical to later Christian devils, though they share thematic space. The underworld imagery associated with the Watchers also warrants attention. Their binding beneath mountains suggests confinement within the earth's depths. Ancient cosmology often envisioned Sheol or Hades as subterranean. In First Enoch, Enoch is shown hollow places in a great mountain where souls await judgment. The geography of punishment becomes detailed, almost architectural. The earth contains chambers, divisions, corridors unseen by ordinary eyes. Such imagery reflects an intensified concern with postmortem destiny characteristic of apocalyptic literature. Justice delayed in visible history is relocated to hidden realms. The Watcher's imprisonment reassures that transgression does not escape consequence, even if the final reckoning is deferred. Archaeological evidence does not confirm the existence of literal subterranean prisons for angels. The imagery belongs to the symbolic vocabulary of its time, yet its persistence across centuries indicates its explanatory appeal. Hidden confinement mirrors hidden corruption. What is bound beneath the surface shapes what unfolds above. In some strands of later Jewish mysticism, interest in heavenly journeys and angelic hierarchies expanded dramatically. Texts such as 3 Enoch portray Enoch transformed into the angel Metatron, a towering figure in celestial administration. These developments reflect creative re-engagement with earlier Enochic themes, though separated by centuries and shaped by new theological concerns. The Watcher's origin story thus branches into multiple trajectories. It informs demonology, mystical ascent, apocalyptic judgment. It reseeds in some traditions while flourishing in others. Each adaptation leaves traces, though none fully preserve the original configuration unchanged. The investigation now confronts a deeper question. What human experiences made such a narrative compelling in its earliest form? Was it political anxiety, cultural encounter, moral reform, or existential reflection on violence? Likely, it was a convergence of these factors, though the precise balance remains uncertain. The fragments from Qumran, the Ethiopic manuscripts, the patristic citations, all testify to transmission. They do not record the first telling, the moment when the Watcher's descent was conceived. That moment lies beyond direct documentation, inferred through comparison and analysis. In the spaces between texts, imagination filled gaps. Communities sought coherence in the face of suffering. The Watchers provided a frame in which heaven's breach explained earth's turmoil. Their story descended into the underworld of spirits and rose again in visions of final judgment. Yet the deeper one follows these threads, the more the origin recedes. The Watchers stand at the edge of history and myth, their first steps downward obscured by time. Beyond them lies another layer still, where cosmic rebellion intersects with emerging ideas about divine justice and human responsibility. The corridor narrows again. In the centuries surrounding the composition of the Book of the Watchers, the question of justice pressed heavily upon Jewish communities. Empires rose and fell across their landscape: Babylonian, Persian, Hellenistic, and eventually Roman. Each regime imposed its own order, each left scars. The problem was not abstract, it was political, social, and personal. Why did the righteous suffer while the violent prospered? Why did covenant not shield against conquest? Apocalyptic literature answered by widening the frame. History was not merely a sequence of imperial administrations. It was the visible layer of a larger cosmic drama. Angels and spirits acted behind events. Judgment, though delayed, was assured. Within this widening, the Watcher's narrative located the origin of corruption before any empire, before any king of Babylon or Syria. It pushed the root of injustice into primordial time. This move had theological consequences. If evil began with angelic rebellion, then human wickedness could be understood as entangled in forces beyond immediate control. Yet the Enochic text does not absolve humanity entirely. Humans receive forbidden knowledge, engage in violence, and amplify destruction. Responsibility is shared across realms. The depiction of heavenly oversight, Watchers assigned to observe, suggests an ordered cosmos. The transgression of those Watchers implies that order itself can fracture. This fracture, however, does not dethrone the Most High. In 1 Enoch, God remains sovereign, informed by archangels, issuing decrees. The rebellion is significant but not ultimate. Second Temple. Jewish texts often grapple with similar tensions. In the Book of Jubilees, angels play roles in revelation and lawgiving. In the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, moral exhortation intertwines with apocalyptic expectation. The Dead Sea Scrolls War Scroll envisions angelic hosts fighting alongside human communities. These writings share an intensified awareness of unseen dimensions, influencing visible history. The Watchers fit within this matrix, yet stand apart through the specificity of their fall. They are not generic spirits. They have names, leaders, numbers. The Oath on Hermon emphasizes collective agency. This concreteness may reflect an attempt to render cosmic evil intelligible, to narrate it with structure rather than leaving it as vague chaos. Some scholars have suggested that the Watchers' narrative functions as a polemic against certain priestly or scribal authorities. The knowledge they transmit, astronomy, calendrical calculation, was central to temple practice. The Enochic corpus includes detailed astronomical sections that differ from the lunar calendar used in Jerusalem. Debates over calendars are attested in Qumran texts. If the Watchers symbolize corrupted custodians of sacred knowledge, the narrative could encode intra-Jewish disputes. This interpretation remains debated, as direct evidence is limited. Others view the Watchers as mythic dramatization of cultural assimilation anxieties. The Hellenistic period introduced Greek language, philosophy, and art into Judea. Gymnasia and theaters appeared in cities. For some Jewish groups, these developments threatened covenantal distinctiveness. The Watchers' teaching of foreign arts could allegorize the seductive pull of Hellenism, yet the text does not mention Greece explicitly. It speaks in primordial terms, leaving room for multiple contextual readings. The cosmic geography of First Enoch reinforces its expansive scope. Enoch journeys through heavenly storehouses of wind and snow, sees pillars of the earth, and observes chambers of the dead. These visions situate the Watchers' rebellion within a meticulously ordered universe. Their fall disrupts, but does not dismantle that order. Judgment restores balance. In this framework, divine justice operates on a scale beyond immediate perception. The binding of the Watchers beneath hills signals that punishment may be hidden from human eyes. Communities enduring injustice could interpret their own suffering as temporary within a larger arc. The narrative thus provides both explanation and reassurance. Yet tension persists. If angels assigned to watch could fail, what guarantees stability? The Enochic text answers by emphasizing hierarchy. Archangels report faithfully. The Most High commands decisively. The rebellion is contained. The cosmic system absorbs shock without collapsing. As centuries progressed, emerging rabbinic and Christian theologies increasingly emphasized human moral responsibility. While acknowledging spiritual forces, they often shifted focus toward internal inclination and ethical obedience. The elaborate backstory of angelic descent became less central. This shift may reflect a desire to avoid deterministic cosmologies that diminished human agency. Modern scholarship, informed by archaeology and philology, approaches these developments with layered caution. The temptation to read the Watchers as encoded history, literal ancient astronauts, or suppressed truths, exceeds the evidence. The text emerges from a specific literary culture, one that employed mythic language to articulate theological concerns. Its power lies not in hidden technology, but in narrative coherence within its world. Still, the persistence of the Watchers motif across millennia suggests it touches something enduring. The fear that knowledge can corrupt, that guardians can betray, that boundaries once crossed cannot easily be restored. These themes recur in varied forms. The Enochic author casts them against the backdrop of heaven and mountain, oath and abyss. Archaeological discoveries continue to refine understanding. The Dead Sea Scrolls remain under study, with new fragments occasionally re-examined through advanced imaging techniques. Ethiopic manuscripts are compared to reconstruct textual variants. Each scholarly advance clarifies certain details while exposing new ambiguities. The origin of the Watchers becomes clearer in context, yet more complex in implication. The investigation now stands at a convergence of political, theological, and symbolic currents. The Watchers are neither isolated myth nor simple allegory. They arise where cosmic imagination meets historical strain. Their descent narrates a rupture that explains violence without attributing ultimate failure to the divine. Beyond this explanatory role lies another question. How did later generations reinterpret the Watchers when the immediate pressures of Hellenistic and Roman rule gave way to new cultural landscapes? As Christianity became imperial and rabbinic Judaism consolidated, what place remained for these fallen observers? The answers unfold in manuscripts copied quietly, in commentaries penned by candlelight, and in the gradual shaping of doctrines that would define orthodoxy for centuries. The silence between canons deepens as the story moves forward. As Christianity moved from persecuted minority to imperial religion in the 4th century, its relationship to earlier Jewish apocalyptic traditions shifted. Texts once read in small assemblies were now weighed against emerging creeds recited in basilicas. The language of heaven and earth, angels and judgment, remained central. Yet the boundaries of acceptable narrative tightened. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE did not address the Book of Enoch directly. Its focus lay on Christological disputes, particularly the relationship between the Son and the Father. Still, the broader climate of doctrinal consolidation influenced how peripheral texts were regarded. Bishops sought coherence across regions. Lists of authoritative books circulated, varying at first but gradually converging. Works outside those lists did not vanish overnight, but their liturgical and theological influence waned. In this environment, the Watcher's narrative carried risks. It described angels in corporeal terms that clashed with increasingly philosophical conceptions of spiritual beings. Influenced by Platonic thought, many theologians emphasized the immaterial, impassible nature of angels. To attribute sexual desire and physical union to them appeared anthropomorphic in ways deemed problematic. John Chrysostom and other 4th century preachers addressed Genesis 6 in sermons, often adopting interpretations that avoided angelic cohabitation. The sons of God became righteous men. The Nephilim became powerful rulers. Such readings minimized mythic complexity and aligned more closely with emerging doctrinal frameworks. Meanwhile, in monastic communities across Egypt and Syria, apocalyptic fervor persisted. Desert ascetics read and copied texts that spoke of angels and demons in vivid terms. The tension between institutional theology and ascetic imagination was not absolute. It was negotiated in practice, yet the formal canon exerted gravitational pull. Over generations, texts like First Enoch were less frequently copied in Greek and Latin contexts. The Ethiopian Church, geographically distant from these centers of debate, maintained a broader canon. The translation of Enoch into Ge'ez likely occurred between the 4th and 6th centuries, though precise dating remains debated. Once incorporated into Ethiopian tradition, the text was read within liturgical and theological settings, distinct from those of Rome or Constantinople. Its watchers were not anomalies, but part of a scriptural tapestry. The divergence illustrates how canon formation is not a single event, but a process shaped by geography, language, and authority. The Watchers' relative obscurity in Europe was not mirrored everywhere. Memory fractured along regional lines. During the medieval period in Europe, knowledge of Enochic tradition survived indirectly. The Latin text known as the Liber Enoch was largely unavailable, yet references to fallen angels persisted in theological and popular imagination. The figure of Azazel, prominent in First Enoch, did not dominate medieval demonology, but the concept of rebellious angels did. The Book of Revelation's imagery of a dragon cast from heaven provided a canonical anchor for narratives of celestial fall. Scholastic theologians such as Thomas Aquinas addressed angelology systematically. In the Summa Theologiae, Aquinas argued that angels are pure intellectual substances incapable of bodily reproduction. His reasoning rested on Aristotelian metaphysics integrated into Christian doctrine. Within this framework, the Watchers' corporeal unions were untenable. The Genesis passage was thus interpreted metaphorically or anthropologically, not mythologically. Jewish thought in the medieval period also engaged angelology, particularly within mystical traditions such as the Hekhalot literature and later Kabbalah. These writings described heavenly palaces, angelic hierarchies, and visionary ascents. Yet the specific narrative of the Watchers as sexual transgressors did not occupy central space. The emphasis shifted towards symbolic and contemplative dimensions of the divine realm. By the Renaissance, renewed interest in ancient texts led scholars to seek manuscripts beyond familiar boundaries. Travelers and collectors encountered Ethiopian Christianity and its scriptural corpus. James Bruce's journey to Ethiopia in the 18th century resulted in the transport of Giez manuscripts of First Enoch to Europe. Their arrival sparked scholarly curiosity. Translations into English and other European languages followed in the early 19th century. The rediscovery coincided with the rise of Orientalist scholarship and comparative philology. Researchers compared the Ethiopic text with fragments preserved in Greek quotations and later with the Aramaic scrolls from Qumran. The Watchers, long peripheral in Western theology, re entered academic discourse as historical data. They were studied not as doctrinal authorities, but as witnesses to ancient Jewish imagination. This scholarly re engagement unfolded alongside broader debates about myth and history. The 19th century saw increased interest in comparative mythology, with figures such as Friedrich Max Müller exploring parallels across cultures. The Watchers were sometimes placed within these comparative frameworks, linked to broader Indo-European or Near Eastern motifs. Such comparisons varied in rigor and caution. In the 20th century, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls provided material confirmation of Enoch's antiquity. The Aramaic fragments dispelled lingering doubts about medieval invention. The Watchers were anchored firmly in the intellectual world of Second Temple Judaism. Academic focus shifted toward understanding their function within that milieu rather than questioning their age. Despite scholarly clarity on many points, popular interpretations often diverged. The Watchers attracted speculative readings in modern literature and fringe theories. Some imagined them as ancient extraterrestrials or suppressed historical realities. These interpretations, while culturally influential, exceed the evidence preserved in ancient texts. The historical record situates the Watchers within apocalyptic theology, not technological narrative. The divergence between academic and popular reception underscores the enduring allure of gaps in the record. Where texts are fragmentary, imagination expands. The Watchers, emerging from caves and monasteries, carry an aura of secrecy that invites projection. Yet careful study reveals a tradition rooted in identifiable historical contexts. As the centuries turned, the Watchers moved from living theological debate to scholarly investigation. Their origin story became a subject of dissertations rather than sermons. The shift reflects broader changes in how sacred texts are approached in modernity. Still, beneath the layers of doctrine and analysis, the core question remains unresolved. Why did a community once feel compelled to tell of angels who broke their watch? The answer lies not only in theology, but in human experience of disorder and longing for explanation. The corridors of history continue to narrow toward that first telling, though the door itself remains closed. The silence at its threshold invites further listening. When modern archaeology reopened the caves near the Dead Sea, it did more than supply missing pages. It altered the conceptual map of early Judaism. The fragments of First Enoch found at Qumran demonstrated that what later became marginal had once been mainstream within certain circles. The Watchers were not late embellishments. They belonged to a vibrant period of literary experimentation and theological searching. The paleographic dating of the Aramaic manuscripts, based on script style and material analysis, places them between the 3rd and 1st centuries BCE. This situates the Book of the Watchers among other Jewish writings, grappling with exile's aftermath and Hellenistic pressures. The text is not an isolated anomaly, but part of a broader apocalyptic current that includes Daniel, Jubilees, and other works discovered among the scrolls. Scholars examining these materials note the diversity within Second Temple Judaism. There was no single authoritative interpretation of Genesis 6. The Watchers' tradition represents one influential strand. The rabbinic interpretation that later dominated was another. Both drew from the same brief biblical passage, yet they diverged dramatically in elaboration. Textual criticism further complicates the picture. The Ethiopic version of First Enoch, though the most complete, reflects centuries of transmission and translation. Greek fragments, preserved in quotations, and in a few manuscript remains, sometimes differ in detail. The Aramaic scrolls from Qumran provide earlier textual witnesses, though incomplete. By comparing these sources, scholars reconstruct probable earlier forms of the narrative. Variants reveal how scribes shaped emphasis over time. For example, the number of watchers, 200, appears consistently, yet lists of their names vary slightly across manuscripts. Such differences suggest active engagement rather than passive copying. Names carry symbolic weight. Shemhaza, Azazel, and others anchor the story in personal agency. The catalog of forbidden arts also exhibits minor variations, reflecting evolving concerns. Archaeological context offers additional insight. Qumran's library included sectarian texts concerned with purity, calendar, and communal discipline. The presence of multiple Enochic manuscripts indicates sustained interest. Some scholars propose that the community viewed Enochic writings as authoritative revelation. Others caution that quantity alone does not equal canonical status. The debate continues, shaped by fragmentary evidence. The Watcher's narrative also intersects with broader ancient flood traditions. Mesopotamian epics such as the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Atrahasis epic recount divine decisions to send a flood due to human noise or overpopulation. In Atrahasis, lesser gods complain of labor, prompting the creation of humans to bear burdens. Later, divine dissatisfaction leads to plagues and flood. These accounts differ in tone and theology from Genesis and First Enoch, yet they share structural motifs: primordial transgression, divine deliberation, catastrophic water. The Enochic expansion integrates the flood motif into a moral framework centered on angelic rebellion. It does not replicate Mesopotamian narratives, but converses with a shared cultural reservoir. The ancient Near East was a web of interacting traditions. Trade, conquest, and exile facilitated exchange. Stories adapted as they crossed linguistic and religious boundaries. In modern scholarship, proposals about the Watcher's origin range from direct Mesopotamian influence to internal Jewish development independent of specific borrowing. Some argue that the apkallu tradition provided a template for antediluvian sages later recast negatively. Others contend that similarities are superficial, pointing to distinct theological aims in First Enoch. The debate illustrates the limits of available evidence. Clay tablets and parchment fragments speak, but not always conclusively. Beyond comparative mythology lies the sociological dimension. Communities under foreign rule often seek explanations that transcend immediate politics. By attributing corruption to celestial rebellion, the Enochic author universalized suffering. Empires became symptoms of a deeper disorder. This move preserved hope that divine justice would eventually prevail, not through human revolt alone, but through cosmic rectification. The binding of the Watchers beneath mountains embodies deferred justice. It suggests that hidden structures constrain visible events. For readers of the time, this may have provided psychological resilience. If oppressive rulers were manifestations of a larger fallen order, their dominance was temporary within a divinely supervised timeline. In contemporary academic discourse, caution prevails. Claims that the Watchers encode lost scientific knowledge or secret history lack grounding in the textual and archaeological record. The narrative reflects theological imagination shaped by its environment. Its power derives from symbolism and moral narrative, not technological description. Yet the fascination endures. The idea of beings assigned to observe who instead intervene speaks to perennial concerns about authority and corruption. Guardians who become violators unsettle trust. The Watchers crystallize that unease in mythic form. As research continues, new technologies such as multispectral imaging refine readings of damaged scrolls. Scholars revisit old fragments with fresh tools, occasionally clarifying letters once obscured. Each incremental discovery sharpens certain contours while leaving the central mystery intact. The origin of the Watchers remains a convergence point rather than a single source. Mesopotamian sages, Israelite divine council imagery, exilic trauma, Hellenistic encounter, all likely contributed threads. The Enochic author wove them into a coherent tapestry suited to a particular historical moment. That moment, however, is accessible only through layers of transmission. The first audience is silent. The earliest performance of the narrative, if such occurred, left no recording. What survives are manuscripts copied by hands long stilled. The investigation now turns inward once more, toward the figure of Enoch himself. His transformation from brief biblical mention to cosmic traveler may hold clues to why the Watcher's story took the form it did. Between ascent and descent lies a mirror. The next step approaches it quietly. In the Hebrew Bible, Enoch appears only in passing. Genesis 5 lists him among the patriarchs before the flood. His lifespan is shorter than most, 365 years, and then the text states, with unusual brevity, that he walked with God. Then he was no more, because God took him. No death is recorded. No burial place is named. The silence invites elaboration. Second Temple literature responded to that silence by expanding Enoch into a seer, scribe, and mediator. In First Enoch, he is summoned to witness heavenly mysteries. He traverses cosmic landscapes, records judgments, and intercedes on behalf of fallen angels who seek reprieve. His authority derives from proximity to the divine. Unlike the Watchers, whose descent is self-willed, Enoch's ascent is granted. This contrast is central. The Watchers cross a boundary downward without permission. Enoch crosses upward under invitation. The symmetry is deliberate. It frames the narrative not merely as a tale of rebellion, but as a meditation on legitimate revelation. Knowledge is not forbidden in itself. Its source and manner of transmission determine its moral valence. The development of Enoch as a celestial traveler reflects broader currents in apocalyptic thought. Texts such as the Book of Daniel and later works like 2 Baruch and 4 Ezra depict seers receiving visions mediated by angels. Heavenly tours reveal cosmic structure and future events. Enoch stands among the earliest and most elaborate examples of this genre. The elevation of Enoch may also serve a literary purpose. By attributing the Watcher's narrative to an antediluvian patriarch, the author situates the story before the Mosaic covenant and temple institutions. Authority precedes Sinai. This move allows critique or reinterpretation of later traditions without direct confrontation. The revelation comes from primordial time, unbound by current structures. In some later Jewish mystical texts, particularly 3 Enoch, Enoch is transformed into the angel Metatron, a towering figure seated near the divine throne. Though separated by centuries from First Enoch, this development illustrates the enduring fascination with the human elevated to angelic status. The boundary between human and divine becomes permeable in controlled, sanctioned ways, contrasting sharply with the unsanctioned permeability enacted by the Watchers. Scholars debate the precise dating and compositional layers of First Enoch. The Book of the Watchers is generally considered among the earliest sections, possibly composed in the 3rd century BCE. Other parts, such as the similitudes, may be later, though their dating remains contested. The composite nature of the work indicates ongoing reinterpretation. Enoch's persona provided a flexible framework for diverse theological explorations. The interplay between Enoch and the Watchers also addresses intercession. In the narrative, the fallen angels petition Enoch to plead their case before God. He does so, but the verdict is irreversible. This episode underscores divine justice while acknowledging compassion. Even rebels seek mediation. The denial of their request affirms that certain boundaries, once crossed, cannot be undone. From a historical perspective, the choice of Enoch as mediator may reflect his enigmatic biblical profile. Unlike Abraham or Moses, he is not heavily associated with covenant or law. His brief scriptural mention leaves space for imaginative expansion. By building on that space, the Enochic author crafted a figure capable of traversing realms without competing directly with established prophetic authority. The narrative architecture thus places Enoch at the center of cosmic drama. He observes the punishment of the Watchers, the fate of the giants, the chambers of the dead. His journeys provide continuity across episodes that might otherwise appear disjointed. Through his eyes, the reader witnesses the consequences of celestial transgression and the assurance of eventual restoration. Thematically, the juxtaposition of Enoch and the Watchers intensifies the text's concern with order. There exists a proper way to approach divine knowledge. There exists a proper alignment between heaven and earth. When that alignment is honored, ascent brings illumination. When it is violated, descent brings corruption. In the broader context of Second Temple Judaism, such distinctions mattered. Competing groups claimed interpretive authority over Torah and calendar. Apocalyptic seers asserted access to hidden wisdom. By invoking Enoch, the text situates its revelations within an ancient, sanctified lineage. The Watcher's fall becomes backdrop against which legitimate prophecy shines more brightly. Modern readers sometimes approach Enochic literature seeking historical reportage. The text, however, operates within symbolic and visionary modes characteristic of apocalyptic genre. Its value for historians lies not in literal description of heavenly geography, but in insight into ancient religious imagination and social tension. The transformation of Enoch over time, from brief patriarch to cosmic scribe, demonstrates how gaps in canonical texts invite expansion. The same process that magnified Enoch also elaborated the Watchers. Where Genesis offered 4 enigmatic verses about sons of God and Nephilim, first Enoch supplied narrative flesh. Both expansions respond to silence with story. Yet the expansion does not eliminate mystery. It relocates it. Enoch ascends beyond human sight. The Watchers are bound beneath mountains. Between these poles stretches a cosmos dense with meaning but sparse in empirical confirmation. The text invites contemplation rather than verification. As scholarship continues to parse linguistic layers and historical contexts, Enoch remains a pivotal lens through which the Watchers are viewed. His authority frames their rebellion. Without him, the narrative might fragment into disconnected myth. With him, it acquires coherence and moral direction. Still, the origin of the Watchers themselves, before Enoch recorded their fall, remains partially obscured. They appear already formed as a collective of 200, already capable of oath and desire. The narrative does not recount their creation or prior role in heaven. It begins at the moment of decision. That beginning, abrupt and unexplained, draws attention. Why 200? Why Hermon? Why this oath rather than another? The text provides detail but not background. It assumes familiarity with a celestial hierarchy that is only partially described. The investigation now circles back toward that assumption. What did ancient audiences believe about angels before the Watchers descended? What structures of heaven made their rebellion conceivable? In the quiet before that descent, a different order prevailed. Its outline must be traced in fragments once more. Before the Watchers take their oath on Hermon, the Enochic narrative assumes a populated heaven. Angels already exist in ranks and functions. Archangels carry messages. Watchers are assigned oversight. The rebellion is not the first movement in this cosmos. It is a rupture within an established order. To understand that order, one must look to earlier Israelite conceptions of the divine realm. The Hebrew Bible preserves hints of a heavenly council. In 1 Kings 22, the prophet Micaiah describes a vision in which the Lord sits on a throne, surrounded by the host of heaven. Spirits volunteer to entice King Ahab. The scene depicts deliberation among celestial beings, with God presiding. Authority is centralized, yet participation is real. Job 1-2 presents a similar gathering. The sons of God assemble, and among them is the Satan, functioning as accuser. The narrative does not portray a fallen adversary opposed to God in dualistic terms. Instead, the Satan operates within divine permission. These texts suggest a flexible celestial hierarchy rather than a strict monolithic solitude. Over time, particularly in post-exilic literature, angelic roles became more differentiated. Named angels appear in Daniel, Gabriel interprets visions, Michael stands as protector of Israel. This increasing specificity reflects growing interest in heavenly administration. The Watchers fit into this development as a specialized class assigned vigilance. The term Watcher in Daniel is singular and neutral. It describes a being who announces judgment upon Nebuchadnezzar in a dream. There is no hint of rebellion. The transformation from neutral overseer to fallen transgressor occurs within Enochic elaboration. This suggests that the author reinterpreted an existing category of angel rather than inventing an entirely new species of being. Some scholars argue that the Watcher's narrative reflects internal reflection on the problem of divine justice. If heavenly beings participate in governance, could they also err? By dramatizing such error, the text externalizes corruption while preserving divine sovereignty. The rebellion does not originate in God, but in subordinate agents misusing freedom. This concept parallels certain strands of later Christian theology, though separated by centuries. The idea that angels possess will and can choose obedience or rebellion becomes central in patristic discussions of Satan's fall. However, the Enochic account differs in emphasis. Its focus lies less on pride against God and more on illicit union and premature revelation. The cosmology underlying First Enoch is structured yet dynamic. Heaven contains storehouses of natural forces. Stars follow prescribed courses, sometimes personified as obedient or disobedient entities. In the astronomical book, part of the broader Enochic corpus, celestial bodies adhere to a calendar revealed to Enoch. Order in the heavens mirrors desired order on earth. Within such a system, the Watcher's descent constitutes more than moral lapse. It disrupts cosmic symmetry. The crossing of boundaries destabilizes the alignment between celestial and terrestrial realms. The narrative implies that harmony depends on separation maintained with care. Comparative studies note that ancient Near Eastern religions often featured complex divine hierarchies. Yet the monotheistic trajectory of Israelite religion progressively subordinated all heavenly beings to a single supreme deity. The Watcher's narrative operates within that monotheistic framework. The Most High remains unchallenged. The rebellion is contained and punished. The absence of a detailed prehistory for the Watchers may indicate that the author considered their existence self-evident within shared belief. Ancient audiences likely accepted a populated heaven as given. The novelty lay not in angels themselves, but in their transgression. In later Jewish mystical texts, elaborate angelologies enumerate ranks and names far exceeding biblical references. Yet these developments, though echoing earlier ideas, represent creative expansions in new contexts. The Watchers of First Enoch stand at an earlier stage, where the structure of heaven is sufficiently articulated to support narrative but not systematized into rigid taxonomy. Modern readers often seek precise cosmological maps. The ancient text offers instead a symbolic architecture. Mountains, storehouses, prisons, and luminous halls convey theological truths rather than physical schematics. The Watchers inhabit that symbolic space as agents whose fall explains disorder without fracturing monotheism. The question of their origin thus becomes twofold. Historically, one asks from which cultural and literary streams the motif emerged. Theologically, one asks what function their fall served within evolving conceptions of divine governance. The evidence suggests convergence rather than singular genesis. Archaeological findings provide context but not full clarity. Inscriptions from surrounding cultures attest to divine assemblies and intermediary beings. Biblical texts preserve vestiges of similar imagery. The Enochic author drew from the shared reservoir, intensifying certain features to address pressing concerns. As canons solidified in Judaism and Christianity, emphasis shifted towards streamlined cosmologies. The divine council imagery receded or was reinterpreted. Angels remained, but their roles were circumscribed. The Watchers, with their dramatic descent and hybrid progeny, no longer fit comfortably within emerging doctrinal boundaries. Yet the silence around their prehistory continues to provoke reflection. The narrative does not depict their creation, their assignment, or their earlier fidelity. It begins at the moment of choice. This narrative economy focuses attention on agency rather than origin. What matters is not where they came from, but what they did. Still, curiosity persists. Were they once loyal guardians? Did ancient listeners imagine a prior harmony now broken? The text leaves these questions open, inviting contemplation rather than providing chronology. In the spaces between verses, one senses a cosmology assumed but not exhaustively described. The Watchers stand at its fault line, their fall marking the point where heaven's order touches Earth's fragility. To approach their true origin, one must accept that it may not reside in a single mythic ancestor or cultural borrowing. It may instead lie in the intersection of need and imagination, where communities seek to articulate why the world feels fractured. The next step is to examine how modern scholarship interprets that intersection and where consensus ends. The light grows thinner as the inquiry deepens. In modern scholarship, the origin of the Watchers is approached with layered methodology. Philology compares languages. Archaeology situates texts in material contexts. Comparative religion traces motifs across cultures. Each discipline contributes fragments of clarity, yet none supplies a definitive starting point. One influential line of research examines Mesopotamian traditions concerning the apkallu. Scholars such as Amar Anas have argued for meaningful parallels between antediluvian sages and the Enochic Watchers. The shared elements, pre-flood setting, transmission of specialized knowledge, subsequent judgment, suggest interaction within a common cultural sphere. The Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE provided a historical setting for such interaction. Judean elites lived in Mesopotamia, encountering its libraries and myths. Yet, even within this comparative framework, caution prevails. The apkallu in earlier Mesopotamian texts are often portrayed positively, as culture heroes who civilize humanity. Only in certain later traditions do hints of transgression appear. The Watchers, by contrast, are unequivocally condemned in First Enoch. The moral valence differs. Direct borrowing cannot be assumed simply because motifs overlap. Another scholarly perspective emphasizes internal Jewish development. The brief Genesis passage about sons of God and Nephilim left interpretive space. In a period marked by apocalyptic expectation, elaboration may have arisen organically within Jewish thought. The divine council imagery, already present in biblical texts, could have evolved into a narrative of angelic rebellion without external stimulus. In this view, the Watchers represent theological reflection on evil rather than adaptation of foreign myth. A third approach highlights socio-political context. The Hellenistic era introduced new sciences, arts, and cosmologies into Judea. Astrology, metallurgy, and cosmetic practices were visible markers of cultural exchange. By attributing such knowledge to fallen angels, the Enochic author could critique certain aspects of foreign influence while preserving Jewish identity. This interpretation remains speculative, as the text does not explicitly name contemporary powers. Nevertheless, the timing aligns with periods of cultural tension. Textual stratification within First Enoch further complicates origin analysis. The Book of the Watchers appears to be among the earliest sections, yet later editions reflect evolving concerns. Some scholars argue that the similitudes of Enoch, with their exalted Son of Man figure, may date closer to the 1st century BCE or CE. The composite nature of the work indicates that traditions about Watchers were not static. They were reinterpreted across generations. Archaeological discoveries continue to inform these debates. The Qumran fragments confirm the antiquity of the Watchers' narrative but do not specify its initial impetus. Cuneiform tablets illuminate Mesopotamian mythic frameworks, yet do not mention Hermon or the specific oath described in Enoch. The evidence converges suggestively without closing the case. Modern historiography resists monocausal explanations. Cultural transmission is rarely linear. Ideas migrate through trade routes, intermarriage, conquest, and translation. They are reshaped in each new setting. The Watchers may represent a synthesis of inherited mythic structures and contemporary theological innovation. The temptation to locate a single, true origin reflects a modern desire for clarity. Ancient authors were less concerned with documenting sources than with conveying meaning. The Enochic writer did not footnote Mesopotamian tablets or cite earlier exegetes. He presented revelation attributed to a patriarch beyond living memory. Authority derived from antiquity, not from transparency of composition. In evaluating the Watcher's origin, Scholars also consider the function of myth in ancient societies. Myth does not merely recount events, it encodes values, anxieties, and hopes. The descent of the Watchers dramatizes boundary violation and its consequences. It situates moral disorder within a cosmic narrative that absolves the supreme deity while acknowledging pervasive corruption. Such mythic structuring does not require a historical event behind it. It requires a community seeking explanation. The Second Temple period provided fertile ground. Foreign domination, internal sectarianism, and eschatological expectation converged. Within that convergence, the Watchers offered a compelling framework. Yet even this synthesis leaves unanswered questions. Why 200 angels? Why emphasize oath and mountain? These details resist reduction to broad cultural trends. They suggest creative imagination anchored in specific symbolic landscapes. The Mountain of Hermon, straddling northern Israel and Lebanon, may have carried associations with Canaanite cults or foreign influence. Bashan, nearby, was linked in some biblical texts to giants. By choosing this locale, the author grounded cosmic rebellion in contested geography. The Watchers did not descend abstractly. They touched a frontier long perceived as liminal. The oath itself reinforces collective responsibility. The angels fear acting alone and bind themselves together. This narrative choice underscores solidarity in wrongdoing, mirroring perhaps human conspiracies perceived in the author's own time. Whether political factions or corrupt elites were in view cannot be proven, yet the parallel invites consideration. Modern scholarship ultimately acknowledges limits. The Watchers emerge from a matrix of influences rather than a single point. Their true origin may not lie in one text or culture, but in the interplay of many. Each fragment recovered from cave or archive sharpens the image without eliminating ambiguity. In academic discourse, the Watchers now occupy a defined niche, products of Second Temple Jewish apocalyptic imagination shaped by older Near Eastern motifs and historical pressures. Beyond that consensus, interpretations diverge. The investigation approaches its final layers. The question is no longer solely where the Watchers came from, but what their persistence reveals about human attempts to map the unseen. Across centuries, they have been bound, forgotten, rediscovered, debated. Their descent remains vivid, their origins still partly veiled. The last corridor opens toward reflection rather than resolution. Across the long arc of interpretation, the Watchers have shifted from living theological actors to subjects of archival study, from marginal curiosities to focal points of comparative religion. Yet beneath scholarly classification, the narrative retains an austere gravity. It speaks of guardians who became transgressors, of knowledge untethered from wisdom, of boundaries crossed in defiance of order. Modern readers approach ancient texts with tools unavailable to their first audiences: radiocarbon dating, paleography, linguistic reconstruction. These methods situate First Enoch within the centuries before the Common Era. They clarify that the Watchers belong to a historical milieu marked by imperial domination and apocalyptic hope. The narrative becomes intelligible as theological response rather than hidden chronicle. At the same time, the persistence of fascination suggests that the Watchers address something enduring. The idea that oversight can curdle into exploitation, that intermediaries can corrupt what they are meant to safeguard, resonates beyond antiquity. In institutional contexts, in political systems, in spiritual communities, the fear that guardians may fail recurs. The Enochic author casts that fear into cosmic scale. The story's restraint is notable. It does not dwell on sensational detail. It names arts taught, giants born, judgments pronounced. The prose is measured, almost procedural. Angels descend, take wives, instruct, are bound. The drama unfolds without rhetorical excess. This sobriety lends the account a peculiar credibility within its own frame. The binding of the Watchers beneath mountains introduces a motif of hiddenness that echoes through centuries. Confinement below the surface suggests that corruption, once unleashed, is not eradicated, but contained. The earth itself becomes layered, visible terrain above, imprisoned rebellion below. The image invites contemplation of unseen depths within both world and self. As canons hardened and theological systems refined, such imagery was streamlined. Angels were assigned fixed hierarchies, demons were categorized, the porous cosmology of early apocalyptic thought narrowed. Yet the Watchers remain preserved in Ethiopia, waiting in manuscript form for rediscovery. When European scholars encountered First Enoch in the 18th and 19th centuries, they did so within an intellectual climate increasingly attentive to historical development. The text was examined not as dogma, but as artifact. Its Watchers became evidence of Jewish diversity rather than threats to orthodoxy. This reframing allowed appreciation without doctrinal anxiety. Even so, debates continue. Some contemporary interpreters seek in the Watchers narrative traces of ancient memory beyond myth, suggestions of real events encoded symbolically. Such readings extend beyond the cautious conclusions supported by textual and archaeological evidence. The historical record situates the narrative firmly within literary and theological creativity. It does not corroborate extraterrestrial visitations or suppressed sciences. The enduring power of the Watchers may lie precisely in their symbolic elasticity. They can embody foreign influence, technological anxiety, moral lapse, or cosmic rebellion. Each generation reads them through its own concerns. The ancient author likely addressed immediate tensions of his era. Later readers layered additional meanings. Within academic circles, consensus coalesces around key points. The Book of the Watchers is among the earliest sections of First Enoch. It emerged in the 3rd century BCE. It reflects apocalyptic currents within Judaism. It may draw on Near Eastern motifs without replicating them directly. Beyond these contours, interpretation remains open. The true origin of the Watchers, if defined as the precise moment of conception, eludes documentation. No surviving draft reveals the author's process. No inscription announces the invention of fallen angels. The narrative appears in manuscript already formed, though perhaps shaped by oral tradition before being committed to parchment. This absence is instructive. Ancient texts rarely preserve their genesis. They arrive as finished voices within larger conversations. The Watchers speak from within such a conversation, a dialogue between scripture and interpretation, between inherited myth and present crisis. The corridor of inquiry narrows toward philosophical reflection. Why do communities tell stories of celestial fall? Perhaps because human experience often feels like living amid consequences whose origins are obscured. The Watchers provide a beginning for corruption that does not implicate the highest divinity. They locate fracture in subordinate freedom. Yet even this explanation did not exhaust their meaning. The narrative suggests that vigilance can become violation when desire overrides mandate. It suggests that knowledge without boundary breeds violence. It suggests that judgment, though delayed, remains certain. In the silence of archives and the dim light of monasteries, the Watchers persisted through centuries of neglect and rediscovery. Their origin, traced through clay tablets and mountain names, remains partly veiled. What emerges clearly is not a single source, but a convergence of imagination shaped by history. One final layer remains to be considered, not of evidence, but of implication. The Watchers stand as figures of transgression within a cosmos that ultimately reasserts order. Their story does not end with chaos, but with binding and promise of restoration. Beyond the fragments and footnotes, beyond debates over apkallu and apocalypticism, the image endures. A mountain under starlight, an oath sworn, a descent begun. What follows that image is not explanation, but contemplation. The quiet deepens. There is a peculiar stillness at the end of inquiry, when evidence has been weighed and comparisons drawn, yet the origin remains partially concealed. The Watchers stand within that stillness. They are neither fully myth in the sense of detached fantasy, nor historical actors in the sense of verifiable agents. They inhabit the charged space between narrative necessity and cultural memory. Their story begins with vigilance. They are watchers before they are rebels. The title implies responsibility, an assignment within a structured heaven. Something alters that posture. Desire enters. Curiosity sharpens. The gaze that once observed becomes covetous. The descent follows. In the ancient imagination, heaven and earth were not separated by infinite distance. They were tiers within a single creation. Movement between them was rare and significant. When prophets ascended in vision, it signaled divine initiative. When angels descended in service, it signaled intervention. The Watcher's movement disrupts that rhythm. They descend without commission, carrying with them knowledge not meant for the hour. The oath on Hermon lingers as a symbolic hinge. It binds them together in transgression. It acknowledges fear of isolation, the weight of solitary guilt. Collective resolve replaces hesitation. The mountain becomes witness to a choice that reshapes the world below. From that choice flows instruction and violence, giants and grief. The earth, in Enoch's telling, cries out. The cry is heard. Judgment answers. The watchers are bound beneath hills, not erased but restrained. The cosmos absorbs the rupture and moves toward restoration. Across centuries, interpreters have sought the watcher's first source. Some look to Mesopotamian sages rising from primordial waters, some to Israelite visions of divine councils, some to political tensions under Hellenistic rule. Each proposal illuminates part of the terrain. None dissolves the mystery entirely. Perhaps the true origin is less a single event than a convergence, an intersection where inherited motifs met lived anxiety. Communities under empire needed explanations that preserved divine justice while acknowledging pervasive corruption. The Watchers provided such an explanation. They shifted the initial fracture away from humanity alone, without denying human participation in its consequences. The narrowing of canons in later centuries did not extinguish the narrative, it redirected it. In Ethiopia, it remained scriptural. In Europe, it survived in fragments and references until rediscovered. In modern scholarship, it became evidence of ancient diversity rather than doctrinal threat. Through each transformation, the core image persisted, guardians who crossed a boundary and altered the course of history. The image resonates because it reflects an enduring human fear that structures meant to protect can fail from within. It also reflects a countervailing hope that failure is neither final nor sovereign. The silence surrounding the Watcher's prehistory invites contemplation. The text does not describe their creation or their first commission. It begins at the moment of choice. This narrative economy suggests that origin, in the deepest sense, lies in decision rather than design. The turning of will becomes the pivot of consequence. In the end, the Watchers do not overthrow heaven. They do not establish rival dominion. They are bound, awaiting judgment in a cosmos that retains its center. The story closes not with annihilation, but with containment. Disorder is acknowledged and addressed. The investigation into their origin returns finally to the human impulse to tell such a story. Faced with suffering and moral ambiguity, ancient writers reach for images vast enough to hold both. Angels descending, mountains bearing witness, floods cleansing earth. These are not footnotes to history, but frameworks for meaning. The caves of Qumran and the monasteries of Ethiopia testify to preservation against forgetting. Fragments survive where entire libraries have vanished. The Watchers endure in ink and memory, suspended between ascent and descent, vigilance and violation. In the quiet after their binding, the mountain remains. Snow gathers on Hermon's heights. Beneath imagined hills, rebels wait in darkness according to the tale. Above, stars follow their courses in ordered silence. The question of origin settles into a different register. It is less about pinpointing a first draft and more about recognizing a recurring pattern in the human search for explanation. The Watchers emerge where wonder meets fear, where knowledge tempts and boundaries hold. Their descent is written in ancient script. Their origin is written in the space between longing and restraint. And in that space, history and myth stand side by side, neither erasing the other, both reflecting the same quiet sky.